My son-in-law had a gift for handshakes. That firm, confident grip that lasted exactly 1 second too long, the kind that said, "I'm in charge here," before a single word was spoken. I'd noticed it the first time my daughter brought him home for dinner, the way he shook my hand and held eye contact just a beat past comfortable, like he was sizing up a property he intended to purchase. I told myself it was confidence. I told myself it was ambition. I was wrong on both counts. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in October. I was sitting on my back porch in Asheville, North Carolina, drinking my second cup of coffee and watching the fog roll off the Blue Ridge Mountains the way it does every fall morning, slow and quiet and indifferent to the problems of men. My neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the hill. The maple tree in my yard had gone a deep, burning red. It was the kind of morning that makes a man feel like the world is still basically decent. The FedEx driver didn't even wait for me to sign properly. He shoved the clipboard at me, dropped the envelope on the porch railing, and was back in his truck before I could read his name tag. I looked at the return address. Whitmore, Gallagher and Associates. Attorneys at Law. Charlotte, NC. I set it on the kitchen counter and I left it there for 3 days. I am 71 years old. I spent 38 years as a high school history teacher and then a principal in the Buncombe County school system. I taught the children of this county. I coached their baseball teams. I attended their graduations, their weddings, their parents' funerals, and, when I retired 6 years ago, the gymnasium was full. The superintendent called me the conscience of the district. My students made a quilt out of photographs and gave it to me. I still have it folded over the arm of my reading chair. I raised 2 children on my own after my wife, Patricia, passed from ovarian cancer when our kids were 9 and 12. I worked 2 jobs for 3 years to keep the house. I did not ask for help. I did not feel sorry for myself. I just did what needed to be done, the same way my father had done before me and his father before him. My daughter, Renee, was 41. She was beautiful in the way her mother had been, a kind of quiet, steady beauty that people underestimated at first and then never forgot. She had married Derek Fowler 8 years ago. He was in commercial real estate, which in practice meant he drove a leased Audi and talked about deals that never quite seemed to close. He was charming at restaurants and dismissive in private. I had caught the edges of that dismissiveness over the years, the way he cut Renee off mid-sentence, the way he talked over her at family dinners, the way she had slowly stopped offering her own opinions in his presence. I had said nothing. Renee was a grown woman. It was not my place. My net worth, if anyone was counting, and it turned out someone very much was, sat at just under $800,000. My house was paid off, worth about $400,000 in the current market. I had a life insurance policy worth $200,000 that I had been paying into for 30 years. I had modest savings and a teacher's pension. It wasn't a fortune, but to a man who had grown up with very little, it was everything. And I had always intended it to go to Renee and my son, Thomas, and eventually to my 3 grandchildren. 2 months before the FedEx envelope arrived, I had met with my estate attorney. I had set up a trust that would protect my assets and limit any future son-in-law or daughter-in-law from accessing the funds directly. The money would go to Renee and Thomas in controlled distributions. A separate education fund for the grandchildren would be managed by a trustee, not by the parents. I had not told Derek this, but somehow, I believe he found out. When I finally opened the envelope on that Sunday evening, I read the words 3 times before they made sense. A petition had been filed with the Buncombe County Probate Court to appoint Derek Fowler as my legal guardian and conservator on the grounds that I was exhibiting signs of early-stage cognitive decline and was no longer capable of managing my personal affairs and financial decisions in a safe or responsible manner. I put the letter down on the kitchen table. I walked to the back porch. I stood there, in the cold, for a long time, looking at the dark mountains. My daughter's husband was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent, and my daughter's name was not on the petition, but she had not called to warn me either. S.N.D. I called Renee that night. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice careful and quiet in the way it always got when Derek was in the room. She said she was sorry. And she said Derek had told her it was for my own protection. She said she had signed a supporting affidavit because Derek had explained that without it I might end up in a bad situation. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had been talked into something she did not believe by someone who had done it many times before. I said, "Renee, do you think I am losing my mind?" There was a pause that told me everything. "No, Daddy," she said finally. "I don't." "Then why did you sign it?" Another pause. I could hear Derek's television in the background. "I have to go," she said. "I'm sorry." She hung up. I sat in the dark kitchen for a long time after that. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the years I had worked and saved and gone without. I thought about the quilt on my reading chair. I thought about the quilt. And then I stopped feeling sorry for myself and I picked up the phone and I called the best attorney I knew. Her name was Carol Ann Briggs. She had been practicing elder law in Asheville for 25 years. She was small, direct, and ferociously competent in the way that certain women of a certain generation become when the world has spent decades underestimating them. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Walter, I want you to understand something clearly, but this is not a welfare concern. This is a financial grab, and we are going to fight it." She explained what Derek was attempting. If he was appointed conservator, he would gain legal control over my finances and property. He could restructure my estate, access my accounts, and effectively neutralize the trust I had set up. The guardianship petition was the mechanism. All he needed was a medical professional to say I was impaired and a judge to agree. Carol Ann told me to start a journal. Write down what I did every day. Keep my receipts. Note my conversations. Document everything. "We're going to show this court exactly who Walter Pruitt is," she said. The hearing was set for 8 weeks out. Those 8 weeks were the hardest of my life since the year Patricia died. I could not sleep. I lost 12 pounds. Two. I sat in my garden and I talked to my tomato plants the way old men sometimes do, and I was aware, bitterly, that if anyone was watching they could have made something of that too. My son Thomas drove up from Atlanta the weekend after I told him. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface, the way he always did when he was trying to stay calm, and he said, "Dad, I will be there. Every day. I am not going anywhere." He meant it. Thomas had always been the steadier one, less like me, more like his mother. He had his mother's eyes and her habit of going very quiet when things got serious. 2 weeks before the hearing, Derek's legal team sent a copy of their supporting documentation. The centerpiece was a sworn evaluation from a doctor, Philip Marston, a psychiatrist based in Charlotte, who had met with me for 90 minutes at a coffee shop 3 months prior. At the time, he had introduced himself as a friend of a friend who was writing a piece on retirement and aging. We had talked. I had been relaxed, open, candid. I had mentioned that I sometimes lost track of what day it was. I had joked that I forgot where I put my glasses. Dr. Marston's evaluation concluded that I showed markers consistent with mild cognitive impairment, reduced executive function, and vulnerability to financial exploitation. I stared at that document for a long time. He had come to that coffee shop with a recording device. He had engineered the entire conversation, and someone had paid him to do it. The morning of the hearing was cold and clear. November in Asheville is not gentle. I wore a charcoal gray suit, the one I had worn to Thomas's college graduation, and I drove myself to the courthouse because I was not going to let anyone drive me. Carol Ann met me on the steps. She looked at me steadily and said, "Head up. You've stood in front of tougher rooms than this." I almost believed her. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. 5. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the faint smell of old paper and institutional carpet. A probate hearing is not a criminal trial. There is no jury. There is only a judge, and on that morning the judge was the Honorable Sandra Coe, a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Derek sat at the petitioner's table in a navy suit that fit him perfectly. He had his attorney with him, a man named Graham Pruitt, no relation to me, who had the smooth, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to winning. Derek did not look at me when I entered. He was reviewing documents with his attorney, his head tilted slightly, projecting the image of a busy, responsible man burdened by difficult circumstances. Renee was not in the courtroom. I had not expected her to be, but it still landed like a stone. Thomas was there, in the gallery, his hands flat on his knees, his jaw set. The proceedings opened. Graham Pruitt delivered his opening statement with practiced sadness. He spoke of a beloved father-in-law who was struggling. He spoke of forgotten appointments and confused conversations, of financial decisions that raised concern, of a family who had tried to manage privately before reluctantly turning to the court. He used the word dignity several times, each time meaning its opposite. He spoke of my tendency to isolate, to refuse help, to resist what was best for me, framing my independence as a symptom. He called Dr. Marston to the stand. Dr. Marston was a compact man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the measured delivery of someone who had testified many times before. He described our coffee shop meeting without a flicker of discomfort. And he described my statements about lost days and misplaced glasses as clinically significant. He used terminology attentional dysregulation, reduced working memory load, impaired financial reasoning that was designed to sound authoritative to a layperson and impossible to directly contradict without a competing expert. He had been paid to say those things. I knew it. Carol Ann knew it. But the words had been spoken under oath, in a courtroom, by a man with credentials, and they floated in the air like something real. They called a former colleague of mine next, a vice principal who had retired the same year I did. He testified, carefully and with visible discomfort, that in my final year I had occasionally repeated myself in staff meetings and had once sent an all-staff email with an error in the date. He looked at me once and looked away. I understood. He had been approached. He had been pressured. He was not a bad man. He was a frightened one. At it clear. Then Derek took the stand. He was magnificent in the way that certain empty things are magnificent. A window that lets in light without holding any warmth. He spoke about me with visible emotion. He talked about how much I meant to Renee, how much he respected what I had built, how painful this process had been for the whole family. He said the word protective 4 times. He said he was doing this for me, not to me. He produced a list of incidents: a missed doctor's appointment, a phone call where I had allegedly confused 2 dates, a time I had reportedly written a check for the wrong amount and not noticed. I had written that check wrong. I had caught it myself the same day and corrected it. Every ordinary, forgivable, human moment of my last 2 years had been catalogued, reframed, and weaponized. Carol Ann cross-examined him carefully. She asked about the trust I had recently established. She asked whether he was aware of its terms. He said yes, he was, but that his concern had nothing to do with finances, it was purely about my well-being. She asked who had referred him to Dr. Marston. He said a colleague. She asked the colleague's name. He paused, then gave a name I didn't recognize. She sat down. She had planted the seed, but I could see on Judge Coe's face that the narrative had weight. The other side had 3 witnesses, professional documentation, and a son-in-law who looked like he was suffering through a duty. We had Carol Ann's cross-examination and my own testimony, which I had not yet given. I was about to take the stand when the courtroom door opened. It was not a dramatic entrance. There was no thunder. The door simply opened, the way doors do, with a small mechanical sound and a draft of cold air from the hallway. A bailiff I had not seen before walked quickly to the bench and handed Judge Coe a folded note. She read it. Her expression did not change, but she looked up from the paper toward the back of the room. Graham Pruitt was already on his feet. Your Honor, we have no notice of any additional witness at this stage of— Sit down, Mr. Pruitt, Judge Coe said, without looking at him. She looked at the bailiff. Bring him in. I turned in my seat. The man who walked through the door was perhaps 55, maybe a little older. He was wearing a sport coat over a plain shirt, not a courtroom suit. The kind of clothes a man wears when he has driven a long way on short notice and dressed for respect rather than impression. He had a broad, weathered face and the deliberate walk of a man who was used to being underestimated. I did not know him, but I watched Derek Fowler's face go from composed to blank to something I can only describe as the expression of a man watching a wall fall toward him in slow motion. The color left his face the way a tide goes out steadily, completely, with no intention of returning quickly. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something urgent. Derek did not respond. He was staring at the man in the sport coat with the fixed, hollow look of someone whose carefully built story has just developed a crack in its foundation. The man took a seat in the witness box. He was sworn in. Judge Ko looked at him over her reading glasses. Please state your name and your reason for being here today. My name is Raymond Okafor, he said. His voice was unhurried, carrying the faint accent of someone who had grown up somewhere else and lived in the American South long enough that it had softened into something new. I'm here because I have direct, documented knowledge of a pattern of behavior by the petitioner, Derek Fowler, that I believe this court has not been informed of, and I was not able to stay quiet. Graham Pruitt was up again. Your Honor, this witness was not disclosed. We have had no opportunity to. Now, I'm aware of that, Mr. Pruitt, the judge said, and I intend to hear from him. You'll have the opportunity to cross-examine. Sit down. She looked at Raymond Okafor. Please go ahead, Mr. Okafor. Raymond Okafor took a breath. He did not look at Derek. He looked at the judge, and then briefly, just for a moment, at me. In that look, I saw something I can only describe as the recognition between two people who have been taken apart by the same machine. He began. 11 years ago, he said, I was Derek Fowler's business partner. We co-founded a commercial real estate development company in Charlotte. We had been friends since college. I trusted him completely. He paused. That was my mistake. He described a period of 3 years during which Derek had systematically moved assets out of their joint business accounts into a separate LLC that Raymond had not been informed of. When Raymond discovered the discrepancy, Derek had produced documentation forged, as it later turned out suggesting that Raymond had agreed to the restructuring. Raymond had spent 2 years and most of his savings in litigation trying to prove otherwise. He had ultimately settled for a fraction of what he was owed because the legal costs had become unsustainable. I lost my home, Raymond said, his voice steady and factual, the voice of a man who had long since finished grieving. My wife and I separated for 2 years, under the financial pressure. We reconciled, we rebuilt, but I lost everything I had built in those years with him. He reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and produced a sealed envelope which he held up. This envelope contains the documentation I gathered during my litigation. It includes bank records, internal emails from Derek Fowler's personal account, and correspondence between Derek and his attorney at the time. Those documents show a pattern of fraudulent misrepresentation and deliberate concealment that mirrors exactly what he is attempting here. He looked at the judge directly. Specifically, I have 2 emails sent 6 weeks before this petition was filed in which Derek Fowler discussed with a contact the financial structure of Walter Pruitt's estate and the benefits of guardianship as a mechanism to access conserved assets. Those emails also contain a reference to Dr. Philip Marston. In one email, Derek refers to Marston as, and I'm quoting directly, our guy in Charlotte. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Derek was gripping the edge of the petitioner's table. His attorney had stopped writing. Raymond continued. I also have a signed statement from a former associate of Dr. Marston, a colleague who attended the same psychiatric practice for 4 years, who will testify that Dr. Marston has provided paid evaluations in 2 prior guardianship cases that were later overturned on appeal for procedural and ethical violations. This is not the first time Dr. Marston has been someone's guy. He set the envelope on the railing of the witness box. I saw this case in the local news, he said. The petition had been filed publicly. I recognized Derek's name, and I recognized what he was doing because he did it to me. He finally looked at Derek. It was not a look of hatred. It was something quieter and more final than that, the look of a man who has decided that the account must be settled, not out of anger, but out of simple moral arithmetic. I could not allow it to happen to someone else. It's Seta. Judge Ko accepted the envelope. She studied its contents for a long, silent moment. Her face was unreadable, but I saw her jaw set, the small muscle near her temple tighten and release. She looked at Derek. Mr. Fowler, she said, I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer it. Do you know the contents of this envelope? Envelope. Derek opened his mouth. His attorney grabbed his arm. Derek closed his mouth. The judge looked at Graham Pruitt. Counselor, I'd advise your client to exercise his right to remain silent at this time because anything he says in the next 30 seconds is going to significantly compound what I am already looking at. She set the envelope down on her bench and removed her reading glasses. She looked at the courtroom and then at me. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "I owe you an apology. Not on behalf of myself, I have heard only what I was given to hear today, but on behalf of the process that allowed this petition to advance as far as it did." She looked at Dr. Marston, who had been sitting in the gallery since his testimony. "Dr. Marston, you will remain available to this court. I am referring your testimony and your prior professional conduct to the North Carolina Medical Board for review. You should contact your own attorney. Tex. I am. Tex." Dr. Marston's face went the color of old paper. "This guardianship petition," Judge Coe said, "is dismissed in its entirety. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented this morning, I am referring the matter of potential fraud upon this court to the district attorney's office. Mr. Fowler, you are directed not to travel outside the state of North Carolina until further notice. And your attorney will receive that directive in writing within the hour." And she looked at the gallery, at Thomas, who was sitting absolutely still with his eyes closed and his hands still flat on his knees. She brought down her gavel. The room moved around me. Carol Ann was at my side, her hand on my arm. I heard Thomas's footsteps behind me. There was noise, voices, the sound of papers being gathered, a chair scraping back. I didn't register any of it specifically. I was looking at the window at the far end of the courtroom, where the November light was coming in flat and pale and clean. Derek was escorted out by his attorney. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. Raymond Okafor stood up and buttoned his sport coat. He walked toward the door without looking for recognition, without pausing to receive thanks. I caught up to him in the hallway, my son beside me. "Passer, 18-5. "Mr. Okafor," I said. He stopped, turned. "Why?" I asked. It was the only word I had. He looked at me for a moment. He was a plain, quiet man, and he answered in a plain, quiet way. "Because no one stepped in for me when it happened," he said. "I was alone in it. I always thought, afterward, that if someone had known what Derek was, if someone had come forward, it might have ended differently. So when I had the chance to be that person for someone else, I didn't want to be the kind of man who drives past the accident." He extended his hand. I shook it. None of that 1 second too long business. Just a handshake, solid, brief, honest. He nodded at Thomas, and then he walked to the elevator and was gone. The weeks that followed moved quickly. The DA's office opened an investigation. Derek's business records were subpoenaed. It emerged that the coffee shop meeting with Dr. Marston had been arranged through an intermediary and that Marston had been paid $15,000 for the evaluation, with the promise of a consulting fee once guardianship was established. It emerged that Derek had researched the structure of my trust and had begun the petition process within 72 hours of learning its terms. It emerged that Renee had not known any of this. She had been told the petition was a precautionary measure and that her father had agreed to an informal evaluation. She had signed the supporting document, believing it to be a wellness check form. When the full scope became clear to her, she drove up to Asheville without telling Derek she was coming. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where she had sat as a child doing her homework while I graded papers at the other end. She didn't try to explain or minimize. She just sat there with her hands around a mug of coffee and said, "Daddy, I am so sorry. I am so sorry I didn't see it. I am so sorry I signed something without understanding it. I am so sorry I didn't call you sooner." I sat across from her. I thought about Patricia. I thought about how much of her mother was in those eyes. "Did you know?" I asked. I had to ask. "No," she said. "I promise you. No." I believed her. I believe her still. Derek and Renee separated 4 months later. It was not a dramatic ending. There was no confrontation, no screaming. Renee told me that she had simply looked at him one morning across the breakfast table and understood, all at once and with complete clarity, that she did not know who he was, that she had been in a room with a stranger for 8 years. She filed the paperwork quietly, moved herself and the children to a rental house in West Asheville, and began the slow and serious work of rebuilding. I helped where I could. I watched the grandchildren on weekends. I made dinners. I fixed the leaking faucet in the rental house bathroom because I am still perfectly capable of fixing a leaking faucet, and if anyone would like to dispute that, they are welcome to come to my house and watch me do it. Thomas came back to visit more often. We fell into the old rhythm of throwing a ball in the backyard, which we had done since he was 7 years old and which we will apparently continue until one of us physically cannot anymore. I sent Raymond Okafor a letter, a real letter, written by hand on good paper. I thanked him. I told him what he had done had saved more than my finances. It had saved my daughter and my grandchildren from a future shaped by a man who saw people as instruments. I told him that whatever the outcome of his own losses, he had not been broken by them, and that was not a small thing. He wrote back. 2 paragraphs, clean and straightforward. He said he was glad it had helped. He said he hoped I was enjoying my garden. He said his daughter had just started college. Then he wished me well, and that was that. 2 paragraphs. I have kept the letter in my desk drawer. I am back on my porch now. The mountains are still there, which I find consistently reassuring. The maple tree went bare in December and has been slowly working on coming back ever since. My tomato plants are not yet in the ground, too cold still, but I have the seeds organized in the kitchen, which Patricia would tell you is the first sign that a man is going to be all right. I have thought often about what it means that the person who saved me was a stranger. A man I had never met, who owed me nothing, who had his own grief and his own rebuilt life. He could have read the news item and scrolled past. He could have said that it was none of his business, that he had already paid his dues to that particular chapter, that he was done. He didn't. He put on his sport coat, and he drove to Asheville, and he told the truth. I spent 38 years trying to teach young people that history is not made only by the powerful, that the record, when it's honestly kept, shows us that the most consequential moments often belong to the ordinary person who decided, in one specific moment, that silence was not acceptable, that being a bystander was a choice, and that they were capable of making a different one. I believe that still. I believe it more than I did before. When my grandchildren are old enough to understand it, I will tell them this story, not to frighten them, and not to make them cynical about the people who are supposed to love them, but to tell them that the world contains both kinds of people, the kind who will smile at you while they take everything you've built, and the kind who will drive 2 hours and walk into a courtroom for a man they've never met, because they know what it feels like to be left alone in a hard place, and they have decided they will not pass that feeling on. Be the second kind, I'll tell them, whatever it costs you. Be the second kind.